All right. Well, hi everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Dr. Danica Slavish, and I'm coming from the University of North Texas. So today I'm going to talk about some of my recent work looking at what's called variability in sleep across time, or inconsistency in sleep patterns. So before we get started, I just wanted to give a little bit of background about me and my training. So I received my Bachelor's of Arts in Psychology from a small liberal arts school called Beloit College. And from here, I went to Penn State, where I worked with a psychoneuroimmunologist and focused on looking at intersections between stress and health. After Penn State, after my PhD, I went to the University of North Texas to do a postdoc in behavioral sleep medicine. And here I really kind of started to dive into the current research that I conduct. And for the past 2 years, I've been an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology here at UNT. So here are some photos of some of the people who work in my lab. This is my current graduate student, Brett, who just started this past fall, and some of my other colleagues here at UNT and outside of UNT. So for those of you who are interested, here's our lab website. There's more information here about some of the work that we do. But most broadly, we're really focused on looking at longitudinal associations between sleep and stress and health outcomes. So we take kind of an interdisciplinary approach to this work, drawing from kind of sleep medicine and health psychology, and also focusing on longitudinal statistics. So I'm going to share some of the recent work we've been doing today. So this is just kind of a brief roadmap of what I'm going to talk about today. I'll talk really briefly about the conceptual model that I use to frame the work that we do, and then I want to share new results from 3 recent studies that we've finished conducting. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on each individual study, but I'm really happy to answer any questions that people may have at the end or throughout the talk. So feel free to just chime in if you have questions as we go along. And then I hope we can spend a little bit of time at the end about kind of maybe what are some of the implications of this work for the current pandemic. This is it's weighing heavily on all of our minds these days. How is sleep related to immune function? And how might it be relevant for explaining some of the trends in COVID-19 that we see? All right, so according to the National Institutes of Health, 50 to 70 million Americans suffer from chronic sleep disorders or intermittent sleep problems. So this map here shows the number of days that people reported insufficient sleep in the past 30 days. So looking, for example, at Kentucky, where I assume most of you all are located right now, it looks like people are reporting insufficient sleep, about half of the time, about, 13 to 19 days out of the month. So, this is a pretty severe level of sleep disturbances. And if you look at this map, you can see there's some regional variability, but on average, it looks like we could really consider insufficient sleep a nationwide epidemic. And this is important because sleep is related to almost every health outcome that you can think of. Increased risk for diabetes and other metabolic dysregulation, decreased immune function, cognitive performance, right? Pretty much anything you can think of, sleep has been shown to be related to that outcome. So this is a handy conceptual model that a sleep medicine specialist, Dr. Dan Bicey, came up with. And he focuses on these different dimensions of sleep that are important for health. So the way you can remember this is using his handy acronym. You can ask yourself, are you sated? And that stands for these 5 facets of sleep. So satisfaction, kind of your self-perceived quality of sleep, alertness, how restorative was your sleep when you wake up, timing, when are you going to sleep and waking up each day, and then efficiency, which is the amount of time that you spend actually asleep divided by the amount of time you spend in bed trying to go to sleep. So this is really strongly related to insomnia. And then duration, just the total amount of time that you're asleep and how much time you spend in each sleep stage. So each of these facets is important for explaining health outcomes. So these things affect kind of downstream physiological processes like cardiovascular activity, immune function and inflammation, which is something we focus a lot on in our lab, and then also HPA axis and sympathetic nervous system activity. If these systems become dysregulated across time, this can lead to these downstream impaired health outcomes. So this is a really great model, but in my opinion, it's a little bit incomplete. No offense to Dr. Dan Bicey, who's kind of a leader in the field. So in our lab, we kind of focus on updating this model and incorporating some other aspects that we think are important. So for example, we focus a lot on daily psychological processes. So how do your daily experiences shape that night's sleep for you? So looking at things like your mood, positive and negative mood, stress that you experience, your relationship quality, kind of the negative thoughts that you might have about things that happen to you, and how is that bidirectionally associated with sleep? So how do those affect sleep, and how does sleep affect those next day psychological processes? We're also really interested in this concept of sleep that was not in this original model that I sometimes call sleep regularity, or how consistent is your sleep across time? And this consistency is really important for health outcomes. It kind of serves as a form of natural circadian disruption, and I'll be talking about this more today, how that inconsistency is uniquely associated with impaired health outcomes. And then also, I think we have to appreciate that sleep is a sort of socially patterned behavior. It's embedded in this larger social environmental context. So if you think about things like your relationships with your partner or your children, that can impact your sleep, or the neighborhood that you live in, that might increase levels of arousal or vigilance if you're always paying attention to threats in your surrounding area. Or even things like the current pandemic or socio-political environment can serve as a sort of chronic stressor as well that may impact health behaviors like sleep. So this is the kind of model that we try to use in our work. And I think it's also important to note that a lot of this work on sleep and health outcomes has been done in these kind of highly controlled laboratory settings, which is really useful for demonstrating just one thing caused something else. But we're kind of interested in bringing these studies out of the lab and into people's everyday naturalistic environments to get a better sense of people's actual sleep in their everyday life and, in kind of their natural setting. So we try to bring these studies out of the lab and into that naturalistic environment. Okay, I want to focus a little bit on this concept of sleep regularity. And this is kind of that idea that, sleep patterns can shift a lot across time. If you think about it, sleep is a really dynamic behavior. It's not consistent within the same individual from one night to the next. So if you think about your own sleep patterns, maybe over the past day or two or the past week, right, you might have gotten really good sleep some nights, but poor sleep other nights, or the time that you go to bed may shift around a lot. And this is important because this inconsistency in sleep patterns is uniquely associated with health outcomes. So for example, you can also think about times in your life when you might have a lot of variability in your sleep. So maybe you're a shift worker, or you're caring for a small child, right, or someone else in your family, and you're not able to maintain a consistent sleep pattern across time. And a lot of these previous studies just ask people about their sleep in the past 2 weeks or the past 30 days, right? And that could obscure that important variability that's uniquely associated with health outcomes. So just to illustrate that, if you look at this figure here, this shows two people with the exact same average sleep patterns across time, but very different levels of variability. So you can see one person's pretty stable, the other person gets a lot of sleep some nights, but very short sleep other nights, right? The mean of people's sleep and their variability is typically correlated. So people with poor average sleep tend to have more variability in their sleep. But a lot of recent work has shown that even after you control for people's average sleep patterns, if they fluctuate a lot, they're at risk for adverse outcomes. So today I'm going to be focusing on some of the causes and the consequences of that variability in sleep. Okay. All right, so the first study that I'm going to talk about today is an ongoing longitudinal study that was conducted with some of my colleagues at Penn State. In this study we're going to be focusing specifically looking at personality factors and daily mood and rumination as predictors of sleep. All right, so in this study, we really wanted to examine both kind of understanding who is most at risk for impaired sleep and when are they most at risk. So what sort of days are most impactful for sleep that night? What sort of kind of daily patterns might impact a person's sleep? So there's been a lot of work showing that neuroticism, which is kind of the tendency to perceive your environment as threatening and difficult to manage, that's linked with both increased stress reactivity, but also increased risk for insomnia. And this is probably due to, kind of the hyper arousal that individuals may experience if they're, kind of constantly scanning their environment for threats or feeling overwhelmed. That can activate the sympathetic nervous system and HPA axis and make it harder to fall asleep and stay asleep at night. Okay, but again, a lot of these studies are based on kind of cross-sectional designs. So we don't really have a sense of, how does this process unfold in daily life? How is it that neuroticism may impact impaired sleep? So we really wanted to understand both kind of who is most at risk for sleep and when are they most vulnerable. And this is important because it can tell us, both identifying individuals who may be at increased risk and then also what sort of daily patterns might be most important to intervene to improve these individuals' sleep. All right, so the objectives of this particular study were to look at neuroticism as a predictor of kind of people's average sleep patterns across 14 days. And this was to replicate prior work that's shown that neuroticism is a really strong predictor of poor sleep, but to use a more valid, ecologically valid measure of sleep patterns across time. So we looked at people's day-to-day sleep across 14 days, and I'll explain the study in more detail here in a second. And then regardless of a person's personality traits, we wanted to see if days characterized by high levels of negative emotions and rumination or thinking about the same problem over and over again, if that was associated with impaired sleep that subsequent night. And then finally, we were interested in seeing, do people who report higher levels of this trait, neuroticism, exhibit stronger associations between mood and rumination and sleep? So are they more impacted by negative mood and rumination in terms of that night's sleep? So the individuals in this particular study, part of this ongoing longitudinal study, were recruited from Co-op City in the Bronx, New York. And these individuals were relatively kind of middle-aged adults, pretty diverse in terms of race and ethnicity, primarily female sample. And these individuals were recruited using random digit dialing, so they theoretically were fairly representative of this larger community. Okay, we use a protocol that some of you may be familiar with called ecological momentary assessment. And basically, this involves giving people a smartphone and then having them complete these surveys in their daily life, in their naturalistic kind of environment, using these repeated measures across time. So at baseline, people self-reported their neuroticism levels using a validated subscale from a larger measure. And then they completed 14 days of these surveys on the smartphones that they were given. So each morning when they woke up, they reported on their sleep the previous night. so sleep quality and difficulty falling asleep on a scale of 0 to 100. And then in the evening, each evening for this 14-day period, they reported on their negative emotions that they experienced the previous day and their levels of rumination. So, one example of a question getting at rumination is the question you can see here. Today, how often did you think about situations that upset you? And then they use this little slider scale to indicate on a scale of 0 to 100 how much they identified with this question. So I then use a statistical technique called multi-level modeling, so we could look at day-to-day associations between mood and rumination on that night's sleep. Okay, so just looking at some of the descriptive results, I know this is a lot of numbers and not all of this is super important, but what I want to draw your attention to is the first two columns here. And this shows us for those measures that we assessed every 14 days, it kind of breaks down how much of the variance in that outcome or that variable was due to differences between one person to the next. So what are called between person differences compared to day-to-day differences in each of these variables. So comparing like one of my days to the next day. So if you look at the first column here, if you go down to sleep quality and difficulty falling asleep, what you can see here essentially is that there's a lot of variation in sleep and sleep quality and difficulty falling asleep from day to day. So people are not consistent in their sleep quality and difficulty falling asleep patterns across this 14-day period. So they're fluctuating a lot across time. All right, so looking at the results, we did find that kind of not that surprisingly, people who endorsed higher levels of neuroticism reported poor sleep quality and more difficulty falling asleep. So this kind of replicates prior work, but again, it provides a more valid estimate of sleep because we're looking at this kind of aggregated across 14 days in people's naturalistic environments. When we looked at kind of the day-to-day associations, we found that on days when people reported really high levels of rumination, they had more difficulty falling asleep and poorer sleep quality that night. So this is comparing people to their average. So on days when I have more rumination than I typically have, I have worse sleep that night. And this is kind of the same pattern that we found for negative mood. So when you experience a lot of negative emotions, people reported more difficulty falling asleep and poorer sleep quality. All right, next we wanted to see, does people's baseline levels of personality impact these day-to-day associations? So looking at neuroticism as a moderator of these daily associations. And interestingly, we found that it did not moderate the association. So basically what this tells us is that regardless of your personality characteristics, it seems like on days when you have really poor mood and high levels of rumination, or at least higher than your average, you experience difficulties in falling asleep and poor sleep quality that night. Okay, so kind of putting this all together here, this shows us that personality characteristics like neuroticism are important for sleep. In this case, it was a strong predictor of poor sleep. However, interestingly, we found that, regardless of your personality characteristic of neuroticism, when you have a particularly bad day, that's associated with worse sleep that night. And I actually kind of see this as like an uplifting message because mood and rumination are, things that we can intervene upon, right? So this is actually already sort of a target for a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy, sort of cognitive restructuring or coping with stressors that people may experience, right? Accepting negative emotions and trying to foster positive emotions, and sort of non-judgmental thought, right? So basically, these are things that we can improve through these cognitive behavioral techniques. And I think these results also suggest the possibility of intervening in people's daily life. So now there are technologies that allow us to implement these kind of interventions on people's smartphones. So we could say, are you having a lot of negative mood today? What is your level of rumination that you're experiencing? And if people report particularly high levels, that might be a point where we could intervene. So I think, this shows us that personality traits are important for health, but even above and beyond that, when you have a particularly, disruptive day, that could impact your nightly experience of sleep. Okay, so the next study that I want to focus on is looking more at this concept of sleep regularity and how that is associated with odds of having comorbid medical problems. So basically, is instability in your sleep patterns kind of a phenotype for various chronic disease risk? Right, so a lot of emerging research has shown that people who have more variability in their sleep schedules, so less consistency in their sleep across time, are unfortunately at risk for several impaired health outcomes. So increased risk for depression and anxiety, metabolic dysregulation, insomnia, and then also some biomarkers that kind of indicate potentially physiological dysregulation, like inflammation and cortisol dysregulation. So while these studies have shown this, there's some existing limitations of the literature. So a lot of times people don't use large representative samples. They might only assess sleep across a few days. They might only use subjective measures of sleep. And they don't use kind of diverse samples in terms of age and race, ethnicity, and gender. So to address these gaps, we wanted to see if people's average sleep patterns across 14 days were associated with their odds of having various medical problems. So this is, again, to kind of replicate what other studies have shown. Basically, if you have poor sleep on average, you're at increased risk for some of these common medical conditions. But then above and beyond that, when people have, or do people who have more variability in their sleep patterns also have increased risk for these same medical conditions? All right, so the individuals in this study were recruited again for a larger longitudinal investigation. Everyone in this study was from the Memphis, Tennessee area. And these individuals were recruited using a random digit dialing technique, and they were stratified by several demographic characteristics. So essentially, again, like the previous study, this sample was theoretically kind of representative of the Memphis, Tennessee area. And the cool thing is we had people who ranged in age from age 20 to almost age 100. So a lot of variability in terms of age. So for this study, people completed 14 days of something we call sleep diaries, which is essentially just a self-report measure of your sleep the previous night. And you fill this out every morning. This study was conducted back in the early 2000s, so people actually did this on pencil and paper in this case and mailed them back in. I wasn't involved in the data entry for that, but I can imagine that was a pretty big task. Now we do that using smartphones. So they completed these self-report assessments of sleep. And then after we received the data, we calculated the mean sleep, so their average sleep patterns across these 14 days, and then their intra-individual variability, or that standard deviation in their sleep patterns across time, to see how much they were fluctuating across these 14 days. And we assessed several different sleep characteristics. So some of the ones, like I mentioned before, duration, efficiency, which is the time they spend actually asleep divided by the time they spend in bed, There's subjective sleep quality, and then something called circadian midpoint. So this is basically just the halfway point between when you fall asleep and when you wake up. So if I go to sleep at midnight and wake up at 6 a.m., my midpoint would be 3 a.m. And then we just asked them to report their current medical conditions. So unfortunately, we weren't able to confirm this with a medical diagnosis, but we just asked people to indicate if they had any of these conditions. All right, so just looking at some of the descriptives here, again, I just want to draw your attention to these boxes in red. And essentially what this shows us is kind of like what I was mentioning before that other research has shown. So basically, people who had poor average sleep across the 14 days, so they had shorter sleep duration, poor sleep quality, lower sleep efficiency, and later sleep timing, so they're going to sleep later and waking up later, those individuals had more variability in their sleep across time. So what this is telling us is that, again, the mean and the variability are associated. So poor average sleep is typically associated with more fluctuations across time. All right, so when we look at the individual results from average sleep predicting each of these health conditions, so do people with poor average sleep have increased risk or increased odds of having each of these conditions? So in alignment with previous research, we found that people who have longer sleep duration across these 14 days on average have lower odds of gastrointestinal problems and anxiety. So the longer you sleep on average, you have a decreased odds of a few of these medical conditions. So this is a forest plot here. This just shows the odds ratios on the right-hand side, and then the 95% confidence intervals. So if the odds ratio is less than 1, it's telling you that there's a decreased odds, and if it's more than 1, you have increased odds. And if that confidence interval, that bracket, includes 1, that means that it's not statistically significant. So I don't know if you're able to see my mouse here, but you can see anxiety and gastrointestinal problems were the only significant correlates here. All right, so this is looking at average sleep. So what about variability in sleep? When we use that person level standard deviation to predict the same medical problems, what do we find? All right, so this is the really interesting part, I think, that even after you control for people's average sleep patterns, people who have more variable sleep across this 14 days, variable sleep duration specifically, had higher odds of several medical conditions. So people who had less stable sleep or more variability in sleep had increased odds of neurological problems, breathing problems, pain, GI problems, and depression. And this is after correcting for false discovery rate, because we ran several analyses. So in this case, it looks like anxiety is significant, but it's not. So basically, people who fluctuate a lot in their sleep seem to also be at increased risk for having some of these medical conditions, these chronic conditions. Another interesting thing that we found is that these are actually pretty large effect sizes. So interestingly, things like age were actually less robust, less strong predictors of these medical conditions than variability in sleep. So we think of age as being like the #1 risk factor for chronic conditions, right? Typically. But interestingly, even after controlling for age, we still find these significant results. And the effects of variability in sleep were almost double the effects of what we saw for age. So there's something going on here. And there's a number of kind of potential explanations for how this relationship between variable sleep and these chronic conditions could occur. All right, and I'll talk about some of those here in a second. So basically, summarizing these results, we find that people's average kind of typical sleep patterns are associated with some chronic conditions, but variability in sleep seems to be a stronger and more robust and consistent predictor of whether or not people have these medical conditions. All right, so what could explain this relationship? You might be asking yourself, well, could it be the other way around, right? Could it be that people who have these medical conditions just can't get consistent sleep? Maybe they are experiencing a lot of pain or other physical discomfort, right? And some nights they are able to get restorative sleep, but other nights they have to take pain medication in the middle of the night or wake up, right? So it could actually be the opposite. It could be that these medical problems cause unstable sleep patterns. And we weren't really able to assess that in this study. It's just cross-sectional kind of data. It could also be that this variability in sleep leads to direct changes or circadian disruption in like metabolic, cardiovascular, immune function that predicts impaired health outcomes across time. I think another really likely explanation is that maybe there's some third variable that's explaining both variability in sleep and risk for these medical conditions. So if you think about things like stress, right? People who are experiencing high levels of stress probably have inconsistent sleep patterns, and also that stress could impact their odds of having chronic disease, right? So I think we have to explore that as a potential explanation in future research. So this opens up a lot of questions, and I'm open to any thoughts other people have. One other thing that could be going on is that it could be that people who have variable sleep schedules are also engaging in other health behaviors to kind of compensate. So if you think about like alcohol usage or sleeping medication usage or caffeine, right? When you have a night of bad sleep, you might engage in some of those behaviors to try to keep yourself awake, right? Or stay focused. And maybe it's that's also explaining increased risk for chronic health conditions. All right, so taking this study one step further, the last study that I'm going to talk about today is exploring some of those physiological mechanisms of how variability in sleep might actually lead to increased disease risk. So how is it that relationship unfolds? So we wanted to explore levels of inflammation and see if that might explain this association that we observed in the previous study. Okay, so if we kind of think about how does sleep affect our immune function, there's a really strong bidirectional relationship between the immune system and sleep. So after a night of poor sleep, or you're waking up a lot during the night, you're getting short sleep, that leads to the release of the neurotransmitters norepinephrine and epinephrine. And these kind of initiate a cascade that leads to the release of what are called pro-inflammatory cytokines. And this is kind of an adaptive response in the short term because it actually induces sleepiness and may help you compensate for that sleep that you didn't get the previous night. But if this pattern of disrupted sleep occurs across time, it can actually lead to a low-grade systemic level of inflammation of these pro-inflammatory cytokines that's actually really detrimental for health outcomes. So this low-grade systemic inflammation is characteristic of a lot of chronic diseases that we think of, like cardiovascular disease, cancer, and depression. And this inflammation can be measured through the circulating levels of cytokines, things like interleukin-6 and TNF-alpha and C-reactive protein are some of these specific markers that indicate levels of inflammation in the body. All right, so the objectives of this study were to examine, kind of like we did in the previous study, but instead of medical conditions, we're looking at these markers of inflammation that have been shown to be associated with poor sleep. So we wanted to see, do people with poor average sleep patterns have increased levels of these sort of detrimental inflammatory cytokines? And then also, do people with more variable sleep have the same kind of patterns, so higher levels of inflammation? So we looked at these 4 specific biomarkers. just because these are the ones that have been most robustly associated with sleep in previous research. All right, so the individuals in this study were 392 nurses. And if you're ever looking to conduct a study among healthcare workers, I would strongly suggest recruiting nurses because they were the most amazing participants. They were extremely compliant, very conscientious. We had really high or low rates of attrition. So I would say that they were an excellent group of individuals to work with. And these people were recruited from 2 regional hospitals in the Dallas, Texas area. And the sample kind of matched demographics of nurses nationwide, so primarily female. And we had individuals who were between the ages of 18 and 65 for this particular study. And a sizable number of individuals were recent night shift workers. So they reported working a night shift, so a shift between 9 p.m. and 6 a.m. in the past week. And individuals it was a primarily white sample with some representation from other racial ethnic groups. Okay, so the individuals in this study completed a survey at baseline to assess like age and other demographic characteristics. They then went on to complete 14 days of sleep diaries using a smartphone. So they reported on their sleep each morning, reflecting back on the previous night's sleep. And then they also wore this thing called an actigraphy device, which is a more objective way to assess sleep. So this is kind of like a Fitbit, which some of you may have, or an Apple Watch, a little bit more sophisticated just because it has an accelerometer, but also a light sensor. So it can detect different waves of light that individuals are exposed to, and then we're able to kind of infer when people are asleep and waking up based on that movement and light levels. So on day 7, we collected a blood draw to assess inflammatory markers. So we only looked at the first 7 days of sleep data because we wanted to look at sleep leading up to that blood draw on day 7. All right, so this is a very large correlation matrix, a little bit overwhelming, I realize. But basically, I want to draw your attention to a few things here, just some kind of interesting bivariate associations. So if we look at the correlations, again, like we did in the previous study, between mean sleep and variability in sleep, we see the pattern again that people who have poor average sleep across 7 days also have more variability in sleep. Also, another interesting thing that you can see here, these aren't as strong of correlations, but if we look at the specific inflammatory marker, interleukin-6, and this is one of the inflammatory markers most strongly associated with impaired sleep, basically we see that people who have poor average sleep and more variable sleep across sleep diary and actigraphy measures, they have higher levels of this inflammatory biomarker. The other interesting thing that we see is that people who said they were a night shift worker also had higher levels of this inflammatory biomarker. So something is going on here, I think, kind of replicating what we found in the previous study, but looking at these specific inflammatory markers. All right, so when we look at these models, kind of controlling for some other factors, basically what we found is that people, and I'm just going to focus on some of the results here, just looking at sleep duration and this specific inflammatory marker, IL-6, people who had more variable sleep duration across the 7 days also had higher levels of this inflammatory biomarker. And this was the case whether or not whether we measured sleep using actigraphy or self-report. So this graph here just shows you on the x-axis the amount of variability in people's sleep duration across the 7 days. So higher levels mean more variability across time, and then their levels of interleukin-6 on the y-axis. So, and again, measured using self-report or actigraphy, we see kind of the same pattern. Now, this is not a super strong relationship. You can see there's like a lot of variability, and the effect sizes are pretty small. But, this was a consistent pattern across multiple sleep measures. And so it kind of suggests that maybe people who have more variable sleep are also experiencing physiological dysregulation of the immune system. All right, so I think what this study tells us is it kind of gives us another piece of the puzzle, explaining how it is that instability in sleep may predict these downstream negative health outcomes. So one possibility is that it leads to this kind of heightened inflammatory state, which is detrimental or increases risk for chronic disease across time if that pattern persists. Now, obviously, we need to do a lot more replication of this work. I think, we need to examine this in other samples across a longer period of time. But this is some of the first work to show this kind of relationship. Okay, I think, it's important also to zoom out here and just acknowledge that, there's a lot of different things that could be going on that explain why people have inconsistent sleep patterns. And I forgot to mention in the previous study that even when we controlled for whether people were a shift worker or not, more variable sleep was associated with increased IL-6. So regardless of whether you were a night shift worker or a day worker, it seemed like if you had more unstable sleep patterns, you had higher levels of inflammation. But there's a lot of other things that we didn't measure in this study that could be explaining why people have variability in their sleep. So we didn't look at whether people had children, if they were waking up at night caring for a small child, or their levels of stress, or the social events that they were experiencing or participating in that might have caused them to go to sleep, late on the weekends, for example. So I think we have to consider these other possible explanations or these other causes and consequences of variability in sleep in future research. All right, so just to kind of put all of this together, these studies might seem a little bit disparate, but basically, I think the first study shows us that if we can find ways to help individuals regulate their mood and these ruminative thoughts, that might be one way to improve people's sleep. And this is already a component of cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, which is the gold standard treatment for insomnia. It involves that kind of cognitive restructuring to help people cope with these negative emotions that they might be having. The results from the second study and the third study show us that keeping your sleep relatively consistent across time to the extent that you're able to, again, this is kind of a privilege, right? Not everyone has the ability to maintain a consistent sleep schedule. But to the extent you can do that, that might be a way to help kind of improve your health and well-being. And it's possible that inflammation could be one mechanism explaining how variable sleep leads to increased disease risk across time. So I just want to echo that, this research here kind of maps on to clinical guidelines. So if we think about cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the techniques that are involved, but basically one component of CBTI is trying to get people to maintain a consistent sleep pattern, and that makes it easier to fall asleep and wake up each night. So keeping especially a fixed wake time is a really good way to help people stabilize their sleep patterns. Also kind of, not spending a lot of time in bed, not sleeping. So if you're not falling asleep, it's important to get out of the bed so that you are consolidating your sleep and associating sleep with the bed instead of sleep with being awake. So these results, I think, kind of, again, emphasize the components of cognitive behavioral gold standard treatments and show us that these treatments may potentially impact health outcomes. All right, so for those of you who may be clinicians in the audience, I wanted to draw your attention to a really great resource. This was developed by some of my colleagues, and this is an online training for those of you who might be interested in learning more about cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. This is a free training, and it's free even if you want to receive continuing education credits until the end of November. So a really great resource for those of you who might just be interested in learning more or helping some of the individuals that you see or treat who have insomnia. Okay, so I want to just end today just spending a few quick minutes on what are some of the implications of this work for the ongoing pandemic. This has been really an interesting natural experiment for all of us. And I think it's interesting to think about for whom has the pandemic made the most impact on their sleep. So some people have not experienced severe disruptions in their sleep. They may even have improved sleep because now they have more flexibility in their schedules, right? So they can kind of go to sleep and wake up more aligned with their natural circadian rhythm. For other people, unfortunately, they may have lost their job, or maybe now they're having to engage in a different schedule than they were used to working, and they're experiencing severe disruptions in their sleep. So this was a study that was done by some of my colleagues recently, and they were trying to characterize who was most at risk for impaired sleep as a result of COVID-19. And this figure here just shows you, it kind of breaks down the number of people who have poor sleep after the pandemic, no change, and then people who have improved sleep after the pandemic. And basically what you can see here is that a lot of people experience no change in their sleep patterns, but about 20 to 30% of individuals experience severe disruptions in their sleep after COVID-19. And these individuals were more likely to be shift workers, caregivers, and people with high COVID-19 related stress. So what this tells us, again, is that sleep is a socially patterned behavior, right? It's situated in this larger context, and not everyone is able to maintain the same kind of sleep pattern based on some of these social environmental forces. So really, I think this shows us that sleep is kind of a social justice issue. It's something that can be largely determined by these external forces in addition to our internal kind of perceptions. All right, and then I just want to end here by thinking about what are some of the implications of sleep for COVID-19. So for severity. So we see in some individuals that they experience really severe cases of COVID-19. So you might have heard about this cytokine storm. And basically this is this like high levels of systemic inflammation that some individuals experience. So kind of putting these pieces together, you know, one potential explanation, although I'm not sure this has been fully tested, is that, you know, people who experience sleep disruptions, if that leads to this kind of heightened pro-inflammatory state, that could be explaining potentially why some individuals seem to be more susceptible to severe cases of COVID-19. So again, this is an untested theory to the extent that I'm aware of, but I think it's plausible that sleep could be playing a role here in survival rates and severity rates after exposure to COVID-19. Okay, so I will end there. I know I presented a lot of information. I just really want to thank all of you for allowing me to be here and for your attention. And I also have several really great collaborators across a few different universities that I want to thank here, particularly my grad student Brett, and then Jesse Deach and Daniel Taylor, who was my postdoc mentor. And then of course, Dr. Gary and Sharon Brummer, thank you so much for sponsoring this event. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. So I am happy to answer any questions, and thank you again for listening.
Well, thank you very much. So we'll go ahead and we've had some questions. So I'll ask the first one. So given that there has been substantial disruptions to sleep, what do you think is a good way to maybe get back on track or maybe adjust what do you think is some good like steps to take right now? Because everyone seems a little bit all over the place currently, especially students.
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. I think that, sleep is really a manifestation of, or sleep disturbances are a manifestation of our daily experiences, right? So, like, if you're experiencing a lot of daily stress, right, it's important to find ways to address that proactively because that's going to trickle down into your sleep at night. So, I think a lot of these kind of cognitive behavioral techniques have been shown to be really effective. So, but in particular, thinking about cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, like I mentioned, a lot of times what we see in individuals with insomnia, and this may also be related to COVID-19 related worries, is that they spend a lot of time in bed, not actually asleep. So you might be like sitting in your bed thinking about things that happened to you over the course of the day, right? And that becomes kind of a toxic cycle. So if you are experiencing that sort of behavior, I would encourage you to get out of your bed until you feel sleepy again, and then only get back into bed once you feel tired. Also, if you are able to maintaining a consistent wake time, that's a little bit easier to control usually than when you go to sleep. That can be a really helpful way to kind of stabilize your sleep patterns too. But if you are experiencing some of that stress, like trying to find, someone who can help you cope with those daily emotions that may be affecting your sleep at night, I think will be really crucial.
Thank you. Also, we had another question about how does food impact sleep and what should we eat more of to help sleep or less of to help sleep? Sorry, I forgot that.
That's a great question. That's not really, unfortunately, my area of expertise. But yes, I think you're certainly right that people's, you know, diets can affect, and also the timing of when people are eating can really impact sleep. So there's been a lot of work looking at shift workers and actually having them change when they're eating. So, like, not eating right before they try to go to sleep. So not only what you're eating, but also when you're eating seems to have an impact. In terms of specific foods, like I don't know of anything beyond just kind of the standard advice, like, eat your fruits and vegetables and, limit carbohydrates and things like that. I'd have to look into that further, but I think that's a really interesting question. And I know there are some people doing that kind of like chrono, I don't know what the exact word is, but they're looking at kind of the intersection of diet and people's sleep quality. So really interesting area.
Also, we had another question: is maintaining consistent sleep more important than getting good sleep when you have the opportunity, or should we force ourselves to wake up when we can, or should we just get like more sleep? Like, which one is better, like more sleep or consistent sleep?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that, if you look at the results of the research that I presented, it seems like even beyond how much sleep you're getting on average, if you're fluctuating a lot, that's predicting, these adverse outcomes. So, these data might say it's more important to get stable sleep rather than the amount that you're getting. But I think there's been a lot of other research showing that the amount of sleep you get also definitely makes a difference. So if you're consistently getting 3 hours of sleep per night, that's probably not going to be great if that pattern persists across time, right? You're probably going to be at increased risk for some, negative outcomes. So I think they're both important. Like, we need to kind of balance getting sufficient length of sleep, but also trying to the extent that we're able to keep that relatively consistent. And obviously, there's going to be times when it's not possible to get consistent sleep, and that's okay. Like, so in that case, prioritizing trying to at least get sufficient length of sleep on average, is important too.
We're about out of time, so I've got just about two questions. And someone wants to know if someone has been diagnosed with COVID, would that affect their sleep possibly? Would they be sleeping more? or like, is that related to sleep, you think?
That's such a great question. I think there has been some work on that. It's kind of just starting to come out. But basically, if you think about when you are sick with any kind of infectious agent, typically you have something called like sickness syndrome. So your body, and this is probably an evolutionary thing, right? You sort of feel lethargic, you feel tired, and that may be a way to sort of keep you inside, keep you away from other people, right? So you're not spreading the disease. So I think that COVID definitely could make you feel more tired, right? If your body is trying to fight off this pathogen, that requires a lot of resources. And I know a lot of studies have shown that people who have had COVID experience some disruptions in sleep. Um, but again, it's kind of hard to know without like longitudinal research what came first. Like, do people with sleep disturbances, are they at greater risk for COVID, or does COVID contribute causally to poor sleep? It's probably both.
And
Yeah,
the
great.
very last question um, is it true that some people need more sleep than others per night?
Oh, this is such a good question. This is a kind of a controversial topic, actually, in the sleep world. So basically, the short answer is like on average, the very large majority of the population needs 7 to 9 hours of sleep per night. So even though some of you may feel like you can typically get away with shorter sleep or less sleep than that, um, there's only a very small percentage of the population that needs fewer hours of sleep per night. And that's based on some genetic abnormality or genetic difference. So I think, most people need that kind of standard 7 to 9 hours. However, there are some differences. So there are some individual differences. So some people, even though they get short sleep, they don't feel particularly affected by it. So their cognitive performance is the same, even if they got longer sleep. Like sleep deprivation doesn't affect everyone equally in terms of things like cognitive performance. But for your health in general, most people need 7 to 9 hours, even if it doesn't feel like you need that much.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank everyone for coming and Dr. Slavish for a wonderful talk and Dr. and Mrs. Brummer for sponsoring these talks. We appreciate it very much. It's been great. I'd like to remind the students to, if they're here for part of their classes, to remember to do whatever the professor said. And also, the professors are going to talk a little bit with Dr. Slavish, so you guys can exit and we're going to hang out. So have a good night, everyone. Thank you. Have a great night. Oh, and do not forget for the CE credits, the link is now working, and the link is in the chat just in case you need it. And have a good night. Thanks, everyone.